They said she was cursed. They said it was because her body was too full, too beautiful for the harsh, cracked earth their small Apache band called home. Beauty wasn't a gift out here, it was a sentence. Her very existence, they claimed, was a bad omen. Every time the creek ran dry, they'd whisper her name, Ayana. Every time a calf was born sick, they'd glare at her shadow. Every time a child coughed in the night, the elders would look at her, their eyes like chips of flint, and they would blame her chest. They blamed the woman she was becoming. The whispers finally became shouts on a moonless night. They dragged her from her sleep, her feet bare on the cold, packed dirt. She was only 20 years old, shaking not just from the cold, but from a deep primal fear. They forced her into the center of the camp, where a great fire spat embers into the black sky. Men's faces, twisted by firelight and hatred, screamed at her. Her name was Ayana, and this was the night she was supposed to die. They ripped the thin blanket from her shoulders, leaving her exposed to the cold and to their scorn. An old woman whose own child had perished from fever a week prior scooped up a handful of ash from the fire pit and ground it into Ayana's long, dark hair. It was a mark of shame. A man whose cattle had withered from drought spat at her feet. Another, a warrior named Koi, whose advances she had once refused, stepped forward with a cruel smile. He tied a string of bleached animal bones around her neck. He called it the mark of the curse. She could already feel a deep bruise swelling on her cheek where he'd struck her earlier, when they first pulled her from her lodge. The pain in her side where a boot had connected was a hot, searing flame under the firelight. Then Nantan, the headman, a man whose face was a mask of stern lines and self-righteous fury, raised his hands for silence. The shouting died to a low, hungry growl. "The spirits are angry," Nantan declared, his voice booming across the silent camp. "This woman's body is a blight upon our people. She is a curse that drains the life from our land, our animals, our children. By sunrise, the spirits will have their due. She will be purified by fire." His words sealed her fate. They shoved her toward a small, dark dugout, a cellar carved into the earth used for storing dried meat in the winter. It was now her prison. They threw her inside, and a heavy stone was rolled over the entrance, plunging her into absolute blackness. She lay on the cold dirt floor, the smell of dust and old blood filling her senses. She could hear them outside drinking, celebrating her coming death. She heard Koi laugh, a sound that cut deeper than any knife, telling the others how he would be the one to light the pyre. But in the dark, something shifted inside Ayana. It was the hard, sharp edge of a flint stone she'd been using to scrape a hide earlier that day, still clutched in her fist. They had bound her wrists in front of her with a leather cord, but they hadn't seen the stone. She began to work, her fingers numb, her movements frantic. She sawed the flint against the cord, the sharp edge biting into the leather and into her own skin. Blood trickled down her arms, warm and sticky in the cold, but she didn't stop. She gritted her teeth, ignoring the pain. Every scrape of the stone was a silent scream of defiance. Outside, the laughter continued. Inside, the rope began to fray. She pressed her jaw tight, whispering to the darkness, to herself, to whatever good spirits might still be listening. "I am not a curse," she breathed, the words tasting of blood and dust. "I am a woman, and I will not kneel." The rope finally snapped. Her hands were free, slick with her own blood, but they were free. She clenched them into fists, the pain a distant echo to the roaring in her ears. Now for the stone door. The night was growing colder. The wind howled over the prairie, carrying the lonesome cries of distant coyotes. It was a song of the wild, a song of survival, a song she would make her own. Ayana crawled to the entrance and pressed her shoulder against the massive stone sealing her in. It didn't budge. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at her. She pushed again, her muscles screaming in protest, her bare feet finding no purchase on the loose dirt floor. It was hopeless. The rock was too heavy, set in place by 3 strong warriors. Then her fingers, scrabbling at the edges, found a small crack near the bottom. The earth here was softer. Hope, fierce and desperate, surged through her. She began to dig with her bare hands, her nails tearing, her fingers bleeding, scraping away the dirt and pebbles beneath the great stone. She worked like a trapped animal, driven by pure instinct. Each handful of earth she tossed aside felt like a victory. Outside, the voices grew louder, fueled by mescal and righteous anger. They were building her pyre. She could hear the crackle of dry branches being thrown onto a pile. Time was running out. She dug faster, the sound of her own ragged breathing filling the small space. Suddenly, her fingers hit something hard. Not rock, but wood. She cleared the dirt away and discovered a thick, gnarled root from an ancient mesquite tree. It ran directly beneath the stone door. An idea sparked in her mind, a dangerous, desperate gamble, using the root as a lever. She searched the small dugout, her hands sweeping across the floor in the pitch black. She found what she was looking for, a heavy piece of petrified wood, long and dense, probably used to weigh down dried meat. It was heavy, awkward, but it was strong. She wedged one end of the wood under the root and positioned her shoulder against the other end. She took a deep breath, gathered every ounce of strength she had left, and pushed. The wood groaned. The root creaked. The great stone shifted, just a fraction of an inch, grinding against the earth. A sliver of moonlight cut through the darkness, blinding her for a second. It was enough. She pushed again, and again, her body screaming, the muscles in her back and legs on fire. The stone moved another inch, and another. Finally, the gap was wide enough for her to squeeze through. She didn't hesitate. She pulled the tattered cloth that was once her dress tighter across her chest, a useless gesture against the cold, and wriggled through the opening. The rough stone scraped her back and hips, tearing her skin, but she didn't care. She was out. The camp was bathed in the flickering orange glow of the main fire. Most of the tribe was gathered there, their backs to her, their attention on Nantan, who was leading a chant for her demise. She crept into the shadows, a ghost in her own village. She moved from lodge to lodge, staying in the darkness, every nerve alight. She had to run, not just away from the camp, but far away. Her only chance was the river. It was miles away, across treacherous, rocky terrain, but it marked a boundary, a place where the tribe's power might end and something else might begin. She ran. Barefoot, she flew across the dry, unforgiving earth. Sharp stones and thorns sliced the soles of her feet, but she barely felt the pain. The adrenaline was afire in her blood. She fell once, her knee striking a rock, but she scrambled back up and kept going, gasping for air. The moon, a cold silver eye in the sky, lit her path. She ran toward the river. She ran toward a fate she couldn't yet see, but she wasn't as unseen as she thought. As she disappeared into the scrubland, a single figure detached from the shadows of the camp. It wasn't one of the drunken warriors. It was the old woman, the one who had thrown ashes in her hair. The woman watched Ayana go, her face unreadable in the dark. Then she turned and with a quiet, deliberate movement, she kicked dirt over the tracks Ayana had left behind. It was an act that could be seen as mercy, or it could be seen as something else entirely, something far more sinister. By the time the first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of gray and rose, Ayana was on the verge of collapse. She had run all night, fueled by a terror that was now giving way to bone-deep exhaustion. The sun climbed higher, beating down on her, turning the prairie into a shimmering furnace. Her feet were a mess of cuts and bruises. Her throat was a desert, raw and burning with thirst. The ragged cloth she wore was caked with dirt and her own dried blood. Every step was agony. She stumbled out of a thicket of thorny brush and saw it, the river. It snaked through the land, the water glittering like a mirage in the morning light. Her legs finally gave out. She pitched forward, catching herself just before her face hit the ground, her body trembling uncontrollably. She crawled the last few feet to the riverbank, her mind hazy. That's when she heard the voice, a man's voice, low and steady. "Hold on there, miss." She looked up, her vision swimming. A figure stood silhouetted against the blinding sun. As her eyes adjusted, she saw a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his face. A simple red bandana was tied around his neck. He was holding the reins of a sturdy brown horse that tossed its head impatiently. Fear, cold and immediate, seized her. Another man, another pair of eyes to judge her, to mock her, to call her a curse. She flinched, trying to pull the tattered rags of her dress closer around her body. But this man didn't move closer. He stayed where he was, raising one hand slowly, palm open, the way you would to soothe a spooked horse. "My name is Harlan Cole," he said, his voice calm. "Got a ranch just up the hill. You look like you're in a world of hurt." Before she could answer, her knees buckled. The world tilted, the sky and the earth swapping places. But she didn't hit the ground. Harlan moved with surprising speed, closing the distance in 3 long strides and catching her just in time. He was strong, his arms steady as he lowered her gently into the shade of a large cottonwood tree. He took off his own dusty work shirt. "Here," he said, holding it out to her. "Put this on. No one should be left like this." The shirt smelled of leather, sweat, and horses, but as she pulled it on, it was like putting on a suit of armor. It covered her, protected her. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she felt a flicker of something that resembled dignity. And with that flicker, the dam broke. Tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed streamed down her bruised cheeks, silent and hot. Harlan didn't say anything. He just uncorked his canteen and pressed it into her trembling hands. She drank greedily, the cool water a balm on her scorched throat. He studied her face, his gaze missing nothing. The swollen cheek, the cut on her lip, the exhaustion in her eyes. "You've been through hell," he said. It wasn't a question. She whispered her name, Ayanna. The sound was fragile, a leaf trembling in the wind. He repeated it, Ayanna, giving it a strength she didn't feel. There, in the shade of the cottonwood, she told him everything. The curse, the accusations, the stripping, the mocking, the pyre they were building for her. Her voice cracked and broke, but her eyes, when she looked at him, blazed with an unquenchable fire. "I had to run," she finished, her voice barely a whisper. "If I stayed, I would be dead." Harlan's jaw was tight, a muscle twitching in his cheek. A flash of cold anger crossed his weathered face. "No woman deserves that," he said, his voice a low growl. "Not ever." He had a small medical kit in his saddlebags. With hands that were surprisingly gentle for their size, he cleaned her wounds, dabbing away the dirt and blood. He tied a clean bandage across the deepest cut on her shoulder. "You're safe here," he promised. "I won't let them touch you." For the first time in her young life, she almost believed it. But safety on the frontier was a fragile thing, as thin as a layer of morning frost. And even as Harlan Cole spoke his promise, he failed to notice the faint glint of sunlight reflecting off something metallic, high up on the ridge overlooking the river. Someone had been watching them the entire time, and they hadn't been watching alone. The sense of safety beneath the cottonwood tree was a fleeting illusion. As Ayanna finally caught her breath, Harlan's horse suddenly lifted its head, its ears twitching, and let out a low, nervous snort. Harlan went still, his hand drifting down to rest casually on the worn leather grip of the pistol at his hip. A moment later, a figure crashed through the tall grass at the edge of the river clearing. It was Coy. His face was smeared with dirt and sweat, his eyes burning with a possessive fury. He had tracked her. He had followed her all night, relentless as a starving wolf. "You thought you could run," he sneered, his gaze locking onto Ayanna. He saw her wearing Harlan's shirt, and his lips curled into a snarl. "The curse belongs to the tribe. You belong to us." Ayanna froze, the terror of the previous night rushing back in a suffocating wave. But Harlan stepped between them, his body a solid wall. "She doesn't belong to you," he said, his voice level and dangerously calm. "Or to anyone." Coy laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He pulled a long, wicked-looking knife from his belt, the blade catching the morning sun. "You in what army, rancher? You think you can stop me?" He was young, arrogant, and spoiling for a fight. Harlan didn't draw his gun. He didn't even seem tense. Instead, with a slow, deliberate movement, he uncoiled the lariat rope from his saddle. He held it loosely, the loop dangling from his hand. To Coy, it must have looked like a casual, non-threatening gesture. It was a fatal miscalculation. When Coy lunged, knife first, Harlan's wrist flicked. It was a movement so fast, so fluid, it was almost invisible. The rope shot out, the loop seeming to have a life of its own. It sailed through the air and snapped tight around Coy's knife arm. yanking it sideways with incredible force. Coy cried out in surprise and pain, stumbling forward. The knife flew from his grasp and skittered into the dust. Harlan gave the rope another sharp tug, and Coy was pulled off balance, landing hard on his back. The horse, spooked by the sudden violence, reared up, its hooves kicking dirt all over the fallen warrior. "Leave," Harlan growled, his voice like rocks grinding together. "And don't come back." Coy, humiliated and furious, spat a mouthful of dirt and scrambled to his feet. He looked from Harlan's cold eyes to the pistol still resting in its holster, and then to Ayanna. He was about to shout another threat, to try and regain some of his lost pride. But this time, it wasn't Harlan who moved. It was Ayanna. She had been watching, her heart hammering against her ribs. But seeing Coy disarmed, seeing him on the ground, something broke inside her. The fear was still there, but now it was mixed with a white-hot rage. While Harlan was coiling his rope, she had seized a heavy fallen branch from under the cottonwood tree. It was as thick as her arm, solid and heavy. She stepped out from behind Harlan, holding the branch like a weapon, and slammed the end of it into the ground right between them. The impact sent a shudder through the earth. Her voice when she spoke shook with emotion, but it was clear and strong, echoing in the quiet clearing. "I will not go back," she said, her eyes locked on Coy's. "Not ever." Coy stared at her. He saw not the terrified girl he had helped drag from her lodge, but a woman standing tall, wrapped in a strange man's shirt, holding a club like a warrior queen. The sight stunned him into silence. This was not the victim he had pursued. This was something new, something dangerous. He cursed, a low, venomous sound under his breath. He took a stumbling step backward, his eyes darting between Ayanna and the stone-faced rancher. "You will regret this," he hissed, his threat sounding hollow and weak. Then he turned and scrambled back into the tall grass, vanishing as quickly as he had appeared. Silence descended on the clearing, broken only by the gentle murmur of the river and the ragged sound of Ayanna's breathing. Her arms were trembling, the heavy branch suddenly feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She let it drop to the ground. Harlan turned to her. He didn't smile, but the look in his eyes was one of profound respect. He reached out and laid a hand gently on her shoulder. "You've got more courage than a whole regiment of soldiers," he said softly. Ayanna looked up at him, tears welling in her eyes again. But these weren't tears of fear or pain. They were tears of pride. That evening, as the sky began to burn with the colors of sunset, Harlan saddled his horse again. "Coy will go back to the camp," he said, his expression grim. "He'll bring Nantan and the others. We need the law on our side." He looked at Ayanna, his gaze steady. "I'm taking you to Dry Willow, to Sheriff Amos. He's a fair man. He'll help us." Ayanna nodded, still clutching the makeshift staff in her hand, unwilling to let her only weapon go. Together they mounted the horse, Ayanna sitting in front of Harlan, and rode toward the small prairie town. For the first time, she felt a fragile tendril of hope take root in her heart, a hope that the world might hold a place for her after all. But Coy's threat still echoed in her mind. "You will regret this." And as they rode toward the distant lights of Dry Willow, another rider was making his way toward the town. Coming from a different direction, it was one of the men who had been watching from the ridge. He rode hard, his face set in a grim line. He wasn't heading for the sheriff's office. He was heading for the telegraph station. And the message he was sending wasn't to Nantan. It was to someone far more powerful and far more dangerous. The ride to Dry Willow was tense. Every rustle in the grass, every coyote's howl, made Ayanna jump. Harlan kept a steady hand on the reins, his presence a comforting, solid weight behind her. The setting sun painted the vast sky in brilliant streaks of orange and purple. But the beauty was lost on her. All she could feel was the pressing weight of Coy's threat, a dark cloud on the horizon. When they reached the weathered wooden sign that read, "Dry Willow, Pop 142, Harlan slowed the horse to a walk. "This is a small town," he said, his voice low. "Folks can be nosy, and they're wary of outsiders. But Sheriff Amos Reed is a friend. He's a good man. He'll listen." Ayanna just nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She clutched the rough fabric of Harlan's shirt, her knuckles white. The town was little more than a single dusty street lined with wooden buildings. The sheriff's office was at the far end, a simple clapboard structure with a single barred window. Light spilled from its doorway, and the sound of a badly tuned piano drifted over from the saloon next door. As they dismounted, the door of the office swung open. A man stepped out onto the porch, his shadow long in the twilight. He was broad-shouldered with a thick mustache and tired, steady eyes. A tin star was pinned to his vest, catching the last of the fading light. "Harlan," he said, his voice a low rumble. He wiped his hands on a rag and shook the rancher's hand. "Don't tell me one of your prize bulls has wandered into Mrs. Gable's garden again." "Not this time, Amos," Harlan replied, his tone serious. "This is different. This is a person who needs protection." Sheriff Amos Reed's gaze shifted to Ayanna. He took in her disheveled appearance, the bruises on her face, the man's shirt hanging off her small frame, and the fierce, frightened look in her eyes. She instinctively lowered her head, feeling the weight of his scrutiny. Harlan explained everything, his voice low and urgent. He told Amos about the superstition, the branding of Ayanna as a curse, the abuse she had suffered at the hands of her own people, and the death sentence she had escaped by a thread. Amos listened patiently, his expression unreadable, his eyes never leaving Ayanna's face. When Harlan finished, the sheriff was silent for a long moment. He looked from Ayanna to Harlan, then out at the darkening street. Finally, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "The law in this county," he said, his voice firm, "says a person has a right to life, no matter who they are or where they come from. Old superstitions don't carry much weight with me." A wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled Ayanna's knees washed over her. It was real. This man, this lawman, was going to help. But the relief was short-lived. Even as Amos spoke, the sound of heavy, angry footsteps echoed from the other end of the street. 3 figures emerged from the gloom, walking with grim purpose. In the lead was Nantan, his face a thundercloud of fury. On either side of him were 2 of his strongest warriors, their hands resting on the handles of the war clubs tucked into their belts. Coy was nowhere to be seen, which was somehow even more unnerving. They stopped directly in front of the sheriff's office, their presence radiating menace. The piano music from the saloon died abruptly. Doors opened, faces appeared in windows. The whole town seemed to be holding its breath. Nantan raised a hand, and in it was a rolled-up piece of hide, marked with tribal symbols. "This woman is ours," he shouted, his voice ringing through the silent street. "She is a fugitive from our law. The spirits demand her return. They demand her blood." A crowd began to gather, drawn by the confrontation. Men drifted out of the saloon. Women came to their porches, their children hiding behind their skirts. They were all watching, waiting to see what the law would do when confronted by the old ways. Sheriff Amos stepped forward, planting himself firmly between Nantan and Ayanna. His hand came to rest, not aggressively, but with quiet authority, on the butt of the Colt revolver at his hip. "This is my town, Nantan," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. "Your laws stop at the county line. This town doesn't answer to spirits. It answers to justice." A murmur went through the crowd. Some of the townsfolk nodded in agreement. Others looked nervous, glancing from the sheriff to the 3 formidable warriors and back again. They wanted peace, not a war on their main street. Nantan's warriors took a step forward, their intent clear. They were going to take Ayanna by force. Harlan instantly moved to block their path, his stance wide, his hands empty but ready. He was a wall of solid muscle and determination. And then, Ayanna did something no one expected. Trembling, she stepped out from behind Harlan to stand beside him. She was terrified, but her voice didn't waver as it rang out over the silent street. "I am not a curse," she declared, looking directly at Nantan, then at the watching crowd. "I am a woman, and I will not kneel to your lies." Her words struck the onlookers like a physical blow. You could have heard a pin drop. Even the children stared wide-eyed. Sheriff Amos took the scroll of hide from Nantan's hand. He didn't even look at it. He just slowly, deliberately crumpled it into a ball and tossed it into the dust at Nantan's feet. "You try to touch her again," the sheriff said, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet, "and you'll answer to me." For a heart-stopping moment, the world seemed to hang in the balance. Nantan stared at the crumpled scroll, then at the sheriff, his eyes burning with hate. His warriors tensed, ready to spring. Then with a guttural snarl, Nantan spat on the ground. He gave Ayana one last look, a look that promised a slow and painful retribution. He turned on his heel and stalked back down the street, his men following like loyal hounds. The tension on the street broke, the townsfolk letting out a collective breath. But the fear didn't vanish. It lingered, thick and oily in the evening air. Because Ayana knew, and Harlan knew, and Sheriff Amos knew, that this wasn't the end. Nantan was a proud, cruel man. His authority had been challenged and his pride shattered in front of the whole town. He would not let that stand. This wasn't over. It was just the beginning of a fight that could burn Dry Willow to the ground. The dust kicked up by Nantan's departure settled slowly on Main Street. The crowd of townsfolk began to melt away, talking in low, worried voices. They had witnessed a clash of worlds, and now they were afraid of the aftershocks. Ayana stood beside Harlan, her body still trembling, but a new kind of fire was lit in her veins. She had spoken out. She had faced her accuser and had not backed down. Sheriff Amos watched Nantan disappear into the darkness before turning back to them. He put a heavy, reassuring hand on Harlan's shoulder. "You did the right thing bringing her here, Harlan, but you'll need to keep her close. Nantan won't forget this insult. He'll try again." Amos looked at Ayana with a newfound respect. "The law is on your side, miss. But the law can be a slow-moving thing. Be careful." Harlan nodded grimly. "We will be." That night they rode back to Harlan's ranch under a canopy of brilliant stars. The ranch was a small, sturdy homestead nestled in a shallow valley. A small house, a solid barn, and a corral. It was a place built for solitude and survival. Inside, Harlan built a fire in the hearth. Ayana sat wrapped in a thick wool blanket, the warmth seeping into her chilled bones. She watched the flames dance, her mind replaying the scene in town over and over. She had found allies, a strong rancher and a steadfast sheriff. For the first time since she was a little girl, she felt a glimmer of something she had long forgotten. Hope. She looked at Harlan, who was cleaning his rifle by the firelight. This quiet, solitary man had stood against a knife, against an angry mob, against the leader of her tribe. All for her, a stranger he'd found broken at the river. Why? He seemed to feel her gaze and looked up, his eyes meeting hers across the flickering flames. He didn't offer empty platitudes or easy promises. He just gave her a small, solemn nod. It was a simple gesture, but it said everything. "You are safe here. We will face what comes, together." The seasons on the prairie turned. Days bled into weeks, and weeks into months. Under the shelter of Harlan's protection, Ayana began to heal, not just her body, but her spirit. The deep wounds of shame and fear started to close over. She learned the rhythms of the ranch. She helped feed the calves in the pale morning light, her laughter startling the quiet air. She planted a small garden, her hands in the rich soil, feeling the pulse of life. She rode the long fences with Harlan, the wind whipping through her hair, under a sky so wide and blue it felt like freedom itself. She discovered a strength in herself she never knew she possessed. The scars on her skin were still there, but they no longer felt like marks of a curse. They were a map of her survival. Harlan was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He taught her how to read the clouds for rain, how to track a deer, how to handle a rifle with steady hands. He treated her not as a fragile victim, but as an equal. And in the quiet evenings, he would sometimes take out a worn harmonica and play old, mournful tunes that spoke of a deep sadness he kept locked away. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, they sat on the porch, watching the sky turn to fire. Harlan reached over and untied the red bandana from his own neck. He took her wrist gently and tied it there. The fabric was soft from wear. "In this land," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "you belong." Tears filled her eyes, blurring the fiery sunset. But for the first time in her memory, they were tears of pure joy. Love had grown here, in this quiet, lonely place. It hadn't grown from pity or obligation. It had grown from shared respect, from quiet understanding, and from the courage it took to stand side by side when the world wanted to tear you apart. Her people had called her a curse, a blight on the land. But out here, she had found a new truth. The only real curse in the world was cruelty, and the only way to break it was with compassion. But Nantan had not forgotten, and his hatred had been festering, growing stronger in the darkness. He was a patient man. He had been watching the ranch from the distant mesas, watching Ayana grow stronger, watching her and Harlan grow closer. And he had been making a plan that involved more than just his warriors, a plan that involved a different kind of law, a colder, more calculating kind of evil that had already taken root in the town of Dry Willow. The confrontation was far from over. It was about to escalate in a way Ayana and Harlan could never have imagined. The peace they had found was a beautiful lie, and it was about to be shattered. The first sign that something was wrong came not from Nantan, but from the town. Harlan rode into Dry Willow for supplies one morning and found the atmosphere had changed. The friendly nods he usually received were replaced with cold stares and averted eyes. Men who had shared a drink with him at the saloon now turned their backs when he entered the general store. The air was thick with a new kind of fear, colder and sharper than before. Mr. Henderson, the store owner, a man Harlan had known for 10 years, slid his purchases across the counter without a word, refusing to meet his eye. "What is it, Henderson?" Harlan asked, his voice low. "What's got everyone spooked?" The store owner just shook his head, looking nervously toward the street. "You should have just given the girl back, Harlan," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "You've brought trouble down on us all." Before Harlan could press him, the door opened and Sheriff Amos walked in. His face was grim. "Harlan, we need to talk." They stepped outside. The street was nearly empty. "Nantan's not the problem anymore," Amos said, getting straight to the point. "Not the main one anyway. 2 days ago, a man rode into town. A lawyer, he says, represents the territorial government. He's got papers, Harlan. Official-looking papers." "Papers for what?" Harlan asked, a knot of ice forming in his stomach. "An old treaty," Amos said, his voice laced with frustration. "Signed 30 years ago. It grants the Apache bands in this territory full jurisdiction over their own tribal members, even when they're off-reservation land. According to this lawyer, Ayana isn't a refugee seeking asylum. She's a fugitive from justice, and Nantan has the legal right to take her back." Harlan felt like he'd been punched in the gut. That's insane. They were going to burn her alive. "I know," Amos said, running a hand over his weary face, "and I don't like it one bit. But this lawyer, a man named Silas Croft, he's got the territorial marshal backing him up. Croft claims Nantan isn't accusing her of being a curse anymore. The official charge now is murder." "Murder? That's a lie." "Of course it is," Amos agreed. "They're claiming she poisoned the child of the woman who accused her, the one who died of fever. They're twisting the story, dressing up their superstition in legal language to make it stick, and Croft is helping them do it." The pieces clicked into place. The cold shoulders in town. The fear. Nantan hadn't come back with warriors. He had come back with something far more powerful. The white man's law, twisted into a weapon. Silas Croft was Nantan's new knife, and he was pressing it to the throat of the whole town. Harlan rode back to the ranch with a storm raging in his heart. When he told Ayana, the color drained from her face. The hope that had blossomed in her began to wither. They had found a safe harbor, but now the tide was turning against them, threatening to drag them back out into the violent sea. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice small. "We fight," Harlan said, his jaw set like granite. "They want to use the law? Fine. We'll use it too. But we're going to need more than just Amos on our side." That night, a storm rolled in, mirroring the turmoil in their hearts. Rain lashed against the small house, and wind howled through the valley. As they sat by the fire, Harlan finally opened the old locked chest that he kept at the foot of his bed, the one he never spoke of. Inside, nestled among some old clothes, was a tarnished silver star, a U.S. Marshal's badge. "My real name isn't Harlan Cole," he said quietly, his back to her as he stared at the badge in his hand. "It's Harlan Kane. I was a federal marshal for 10 years. I quit after my wife was killed." Ayana stared at his back, speechless. The quiet rancher, the man who played sad songs on his harmonica, was a legendary lawman. It didn't seem possible. He finally turned to face her, his eyes filled with a pain so deep it seemed bottomless. My wife, Lena, she was Apache, from Nantan's band. We fell in love, and she left the tribe to be with me. Her family accepted it, but Nantan never did. He saw her as a traitor. One night, while I was away tracking a fugitive, he and his men came here. They said she was trespassing on their sacred hunting grounds. They, they dragged her out and killed her. They burned this house to the ground. He looked around the room at the solid walls he had rebuilt with his own two hands. They called it tribal justice. The law couldn't touch him. The treaty. There was no proof. Just my word against his. So I quit. I changed my name, rebuilt my life, and waited. I've been gathering evidence against him for 5 years, trying to find a way to bring him down for what he did. He looked at Ayana, and she finally understood the fire she had seen in his eyes that first day at the river. It wasn't just compassion, it was recognition. When I saw you, he said, his voice thick with emotion, I saw her. I saw what he did to her all over again. This isn't just your fight, Ayana. It's been my fight all along. I just didn't know how to win it. He closed his hand around the marshal's badge. But now I think I do. The revelation hung in the air, heavier than the storm raging outside. Harlan wasn't just a kind stranger. He was a man with a ghost, a man bent on a cold, patient revenge. His protection of her wasn't an act of random kindness. It was a chapter in a much older, darker story. And as the lightning flashed, illuminating the grim determination on his face, Ayana felt a new chill creep over her. She had escaped one trap only to find herself in the center of another. She was no longer just a victim. She was a weapon in a one-man war. The storm outside the small cabin raged, but it was nothing compared to the storm of revelations inside. Harlan, or Harlan Kane, was a haunted man, a former U.S. Marshal whose life had been secretly dedicated to avenging his murdered wife. Ayana looked at him, at the tarnished star clutched in his hand, and saw not just a protector, but a man walking a razor's edge between justice and vengeance. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper above the drumming rain. "At first I didn't want to scare you," he admitted, his gaze fixed on the fire. "Later, I guess I didn't want you to think that's all you were to me. A way to get to Nantan. Because it started that way maybe, but it's not that way now." His eyes met hers, and in them, she saw the raw, unguarded truth. "This is about you, Ayana. Your life, your freedom. My past just gives us a fighting chance." His confession changed everything. It explained the sadness in his harmonica tunes, the coiled tension she sometimes felt in him, the expert way he'd handled Koi at the river. He wasn't just a rancher. He was a trained warrior, living under a self-imposed exile. The next morning the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and glistening. But the threat remained. Silas Croft, the slick lawyer, had set up an office in the Dry Willow Hotel, and he was systematically turning the town against them. He spread rumors that Harlan was a dangerous man, an Indian lover who was sheltering a murderer and putting the entire town at risk of an Apache uprising. He bought drinks at the saloon, promising Nantan's cooperation in tracking down rustlers in exchange for the town's support. Fear was a powerful currency, and Croft was spending it freely. Harlan knew they couldn't stay holed up at the ranch. "We have to go on the offensive," he said, strapping on his old gun belt. The marshal's badge remained tucked away in his pocket. It was a card he couldn't play yet. "Croft is building a legal case on lies. We need to find the truth." "What truth?" Ayana asked. "It's their word against mine." "There's always a truth," Harlan said grimly. "We just have to dig it out. You said the woman who first accused you, her child died of a fever. Was there anything unusual about it?" Ayana thought back, her mind racing through the painful memories. "The medicine woman. She tried to help. She used a special root, but the child only got worse. The woman, Ilan, she was devastated. She was the one who started shouting about a curse. Nantan encouraged her." "The root," Harlan said, his eyes narrowing. "What did it look like?" Ayana described it. A dark, twisted root with small, pale flowers. A cold dread washed over Harlan's face. He walked over to a shelf and pulled down a worn book on local herbs and plants. He flipped through the pages, his finger tracing the illustrations. He stopped on one page and turned the book around for her to see. The drawing matched her description perfectly. The name of the plant was printed in bold letters, Devil's Breath. Beneath the drawing, the text was chilling, commonly mistaken for the healing herb known as mountain root. When brewed into a tea, Devil's Breath is a slow-acting poison that induces fever, convulsions, and eventual death. There is no known antidote. It wasn't a curse. It wasn't a fever. The child had been poisoned. Nantan, Ayana breathed, the horrific realization dawning on her. He framed me. He must have swapped the roots. He murdered that child just to have a reason to get rid of me. The sheer, calculated evil of it was staggering. Nantan hadn't just used a tragedy to his advantage. He had created it. He had sacrificed a child from his own tribe to solidify his power and eliminate a perceived threat. This changes everything, Harlan said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Croft is building his case on a murder. We just found the real murderer, but we have no proof. No one will believe our word over a headman and a fancy lawyer. Elin might, Ayana said suddenly. The mother. She's lost in her grief, but she loved her son. If she knew the truth, if she knew Nantan was the one who killed him. It's too dangerous, Harlan said immediately. Going back to that camp is a suicide mission. I have to try, Ayana insisted, her voice gaining a new strength. The fear was still there, but it was being eclipsed by a burning need for justice. Justice for herself and for the child Nantan had murdered. There's a place, a hidden spring where the women go to gather water alone. It's away from the main camp. If I can get there, I might be able to meet Elin without being seen. Harlan looked at her, at the fierce resolve in her eyes. He saw the same courage she'd shown at the river, the same fire she'd shown on Main Street. He was a lawman, a man who believed in evidence and plans. This was a wild, desperate gamble, but he also knew she was right. It was their only move. All right, he said, his decision made, but you're not going alone. That night, under the cover of a sliver of moon, two figures slipped away from the ranch. They were dressed in dark clothing, moving like shadows through the brush and canyons. Ayana was heading back to the place she had fled in terror, this time not as a victim, but as a hunter of the truth. Harlan followed a short distance behind, his rifle in his hands, his senses on high alert. He knew every rock and ravine in this territory, but he also knew that Nantan's warriors would be watching, and Silas Croft was not a man to leave things to chance. Somewhere in the darkness, a trap was almost certainly waiting for them, and they were walking right into it. The journey to the hidden spring was a nerve-wracking trek through hostile territory. Ayana moved with a certainty that surprised Harlan, her knowledge of the land ingrained in her from childhood. She pointed out the ravines that would echo their footsteps and the ridges where sentries were likely to be posted. They moved like ghosts, communicating with hand signals, the silence of the night broken only by the chirping of crickets and the whisper of the wind. The spring was nestled in a small, secluded canyon, surrounded by sheer rock walls and fed by an underground stream. It was a sacred place for the women of the tribe, a place of peace. But tonight it felt like an ambush point. Harlan found a high position overlooking the canyon, his rifle resting on a rocky ledge. He had a clear view of the spring and the trails leading to it. I'll watch your back, he whispered to Ayana. If you see Elan, be quick. If you see anyone else, you run. Don't hesitate. Ayana nodded, her heart pounding. She slipped down into the canyon, her bare feet making no sound on the sandy ground. She hid behind a cluster of boulders near the water's edge and waited. An hour passed, then another. The moon climbed higher, casting long, distorted shadows across the canyon. Doubt began to creep into Ayana's mind. What if Elon didn't come? What if this was all for nothing? Just as she was about to give up hope, she heard it, the faint sound of someone scrambling down the canyon trail. A lone figure emerged into the moonlight. It was Elan, the grieving mother. She carried a water skin, her shoulders slumped, her movements slow and heavy with sorrow. Ayana took a deep breath and stepped out from behind the rocks. Elan, she said softly. The woman gasped, dropping the water skin. Her eyes went wide with fear and hatred. You! She hissed, her hand flying to the small knife at her belt. Demon! You murdered my son! No, Elan, Ayana said, holding up her hands in a placating gesture. I didn't. Nantan did. He lied to you. He lied to all of us. Lies, Elan spat. You are the curse. Nantan said you would try to poison our minds. Ayana's heart sank. Nantan had already anticipated this. He had already turned her only potential ally against her. She had to think fast. The root, Elan, Ayana said, her voice urgent. Think about the root the medicine woman used. Did you see it? Did Nantan give it to her? Elan hesitated, her hand still on her knife. He brought it to her. He said the spirits had guided him to it. A special, powerful healing root. It wasn't a healing root, Ayana said, pressing her advantage. It was poison, a plant called devil's breath. It looks almost the same as mountain root, but it kills. Nantan knew. He switched them. He killed your son to make me look like a murderer, to turn the tribe against me. The conviction in Ayana's voice gave Elan pause. A flicker of doubt crossed her grief-stricken face. Could it be true? The headman, a man she had trusted, sacrificing her child for his own political gain? The idea was monstrous, almost unbelievable. Why? Elan whispered, her voice breaking. Why would he do this? Because he is afraid, Mayana said. Not of a curse. He is afraid of something in my past. Something he doesn't want the tribe to know. Before she could explain further, a sharp whistle echoed from the cliffs above. It was Harlan's signal. Trouble. Suddenly, the canyon was no longer empty. Warriors seemed to materialize from the shadows, blocking the only exit. Leading them was Koi, a triumphant, hateful smirk on his face. I knew you would come back, Koi sneered at Ayana, like a moth to a flame. He then looked at Elan, his expression turning cold. Nantan was right. The witch has poisoned your mind with her lies. Seize them both. It was a trap. They hadn't just been waiting for Ayana. They had been using Elan as bait. Up on the ridge, Harlan saw the trap spring. There were at least a dozen warriors in the canyon, far too many to fight. He fired a single shot, not at a person, but at a massive, precariously balanced rock formation high on the canyon wall above the warriors. The bullet struck the rock with a sharp crack. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a deep groan, the entire rock shelf gave way. Boulders and scree crashed down into the canyon, not on top of the warriors, but directly in their path, kicking up a massive cloud of dust and blocking the exit. Go! Harlan roared, his voice echoing through the chaos. To the north! There's a game trail! Ayana grabbed a stunned Elan by the arm, pulling her along. Come on! If you want the truth, you have to come with me now. They scrambled up the steep canyon wall as Koi and his men were still reeling from the rock slide. Dust filled the air, making it impossible to see. They could hear Koi shouting orders, trying to rally his men. They reached the top of the canyon just as Harlan ran up to meet them. This way, he yelled, leading them away from the camp, deeper into the wilderness. They ran for what felt like miles, their lungs burning, branches whipping at their faces. Elan stumbled several times, half sobbing, half running, propelled forward by a confusing mix of fear and dawning horror. They finally collapsed in a hidden alcove, their bodies shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline. They were safe for now, but they were fugitives, on the run, with a hostile tribe on one side and a corrupted legal system on the other. And now they had a witness, a fragile, grief-stricken, and dangerously unpredictable witness who was just beginning to realize that the man she trusted had turned her into a pawn in a murderous conspiracy. The truth was out, but it had only made their situation 1,000 times more dangerous. The dawn found them huddled in the rocky alcove, miles from both the ranch and the Apache camp. They were trapped in a no-man's land, exhausted and exposed. Elaine sat apart from them, wrapped in a shocked silence, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. The seeds of doubt Ayana had planted were at war with years of loyalty to her headman. They'll be tracking us, Harlan said, cleaning his rifle with practiced efficiency. Koi won't give up, and they'll have the advantage in this terrain. We can't go back to the ranch, Ayana said. It's the first place they'll look, and Croft's men might be watching it too. They were cut off. The trap hadn't just been in the canyon, it was the entire territory. Nantan and Croft had them cornered. There's one place, Harlan said after a long silence, his voice grim. It's a long shot, Dangerous. But they might not think to look for us there. He pointed toward a series of formidable, jagged peaks on the distant horizon. The Ghost Mountains. The tribes believe they're haunted. Cursed ground. They won't follow us in there. Not even Koi. It was a desperate plan, trading one danger for another. But they had no other choice. Their journey into the Ghost Mountains was a grueling ordeal. The terrain was brutal, a chaotic landscape of sharp rocks, steep cliffs, and treacherous footing. They had no food and only a little water left in Harlan's canteen. By the second day, Elan was weak, her grief and exhaustion making her delirious. She kept murmuring her son's name, her eyes wide and unfocused. Late in the afternoon, she stumbled and collapsed. "I can't go on," she wept. "Leave me here. It doesn't matter anymore." Ayana knelt beside her, taking the woman's cold hands in her own. "It does matter, Elan," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "It matters that your son's killer is brought to justice. It matters that the truth is heard. Your son deserves that. You deserve that." She looked into Elan's eyes, her gaze unflinching. "Nantan used your pain. Don't let him win. Help me make him pay." Something in Ayana's words, a strength born of her own suffering, seemed to reach through Elan's haze of despair. A spark of anger, the first real emotion besides grief she had shown, ignited in her eyes. She allowed Harlan and Ayana to help her to her feet, and she stumbled on. They found shelter that night in a small cave, shivering from the cold mountain air. Harlan managed to trap a rabbit, and the small meal restored some of their strength. As they sat around a tiny, smokeless fire, Harlan looked at Ayana with a deep, quiet admiration. "You saved her," he said. "Back there. I didn't think she had it in her to keep going." "She's a mother," Ayana replied, staring into the flames. "There's no strength on earth like that of a mother who has lost her child." The next morning, as Harlan was scouting the area around the cave, he suddenly froze. He dropped to one knee, pulling Ayana and Yelena down behind a rock. He pointed toward a narrow pass below them. It was Silas Croft. The lawyer was on horseback, accompanied by two rough-looking men who were clearly hired guns, not lawmen. They were not heading toward the mountains. They were riding away from them, coming from the direction of a small abandoned mining camp, nestled deeper in the peaks. "What is he doing all the way out here?" Ayana whispered. "I don't know," Harlan said, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. "But I'm willing to bet it's nothing good." A gut feeling, the kind of instinct that had kept him alive for 10 years as a marshal, told him they needed to see what Croft was up to. They waited until the trio was out of sight, then made their way cautiously down toward the old mining camp. The camp was a collection of dilapidated shacks in a collapsed mine shaft. It looked deserted, but as they got closer, they saw fresh horse tracks leading to the largest shack, the one that had probably been the foreman's office. Harlan drew his pistol. He signaled for Ayana and Elan to stay back as he crept toward the shack. The door was slightly ajar. He peered through the crack. What he saw made his blood run cold. Inside, sitting at a dusty table, was Coy, and sitting across from him, counting out a stack of gold coins, was Sheriff Amos Reed. The betrayal was so stunning, so absolute, it took Harlan a moment to process it. Amos, his friend, the man who had promised them the protection of the law, was in league with their enemies. The entire town, the entire legal system, was a lie. He had led them from one trap straight into a bigger one. Coy said something, and Amos laughed, a sound that made Harlan's stomach turn. The sheriff slid a leather pouch full of coins across the table. "You make sure she doesn't make it to the territorial court," Amos said, his voice stripped of all its folksy charm, now cold and hard as steel. "Nantan gets his fugitive back, Croft gets his treaty enforced, and we all get what we want. No witnesses." Coy nodded. "And the rancher?" "Kane?" Amos shrugged. "He's a ghost. Let him disappear in the mountains. He's not our problem. Just bring me the girl." Harlan backed away from the door, his face a mask of cold fury. He returned to Ayana and Elan, his expression so grim that they didn't need to ask what he'd seen. "Amos is working with them," he said, his voice flat and dead. "He sold us out." The last flicker of hope died. They were completely and utterly alone. They were being hunted not just by Nantan's warriors, but by the law itself. They had nowhere left to run. But Harlan Kane wasn't a man who ran. He was a man who hunted. And the look in his eyes was no longer that of a weary rancher or a grieving husband. It was the look of a U.S. Marshal about to go to war. "They made a mistake," he said, his voice a low whisper that was more menacing than any shout. "They think I'm not their problem." He pulled the tarnished star from his pocket and pinned it to his shirt. "It's time to remind them who I am."